Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this video series on data centers. Assigning switch ports to VLANs. As you probably guessed, there's more than one way to configure a port, but we're still going to start by joining the port to a particular VLAN. After that, we can assign a membership mode that will determine the type of traffic the port carries. We can even tweak the number of VLANs to which the port can belong. To configure each port on a switch to belong to a specific VLAN or access port, I'm going to enter the interface switch port command. We can also configure multiple ports at the same time by using a comma or dash, and notably, to assign multiple ports to a VLAN, we no longer need the range command we used when configuring multiple ports in the iOS. Alright, so in the following example, I'm going to configure interface E329 to VLAN 3. Nexus 7K config int E3/29 Nexus 7K config if switch port mode access. Nexus 7K config if switch port access VLAN. Set VLAN when interface is in access mode. Nexus 7K config if switch port access VLAN 3. Nexus 7K config if SH VLAN name status ports 1. Default VLAN active ETH3/20 ETH3/21 ETH3/22 ETH/23 ETH3/24 ETH/25 ETH/26 ETH3/27 ETH/28 2 sales active 3 marketing active ETH3/29 4 accounting active. By starting with the switch port mode access command, I ensured that this would be a non-trunking layer 2 port. We can now assign a VLAN to the port with the switch port access command. We're almost done. Do remember that if you plugged devices into each VLAN port, they can only talk to other devices within the same VLAN. But since we really want inter-VLAN communication to happen, it's a great time to get into more in-depth look at trunking, which will move us nicely into VTP and inter-VLAN communication. I'll also demonstrate how to do this along the way. Configuring trunk ports. Because the NX-OS switch port only runs the IEEE 802.1q encapsulation method, we don't need to set the encapsulation command as we did with iOS based switches, because ISL just isn't an option, and unlike all iOS based switches, Nexus OS switches do no auto detect trunking, mean that if you want to trunk a port, you've got to configure it manually. To configure trunking on an Ethernet port, I'm going to use the interface command switch port mode trunk. The following switch output shows the trunk configuration on interface E3/28 as set to trunk. Nexus 7K config if we're conf interface Ethernet 3/29 admin Nexus 7K Nexus 20% default Nexus 7K int E3/28 Nexus 7K config if switch port mode access DOT1Q tunnel port mode .1Q tunnel vex fabric port mode FEX fabric trunk port mode trunk. Nexus 7K config if switch port mode trunk. Pretty simple and straightforward. To disable trunking on an interface, use the switch port mode access command, which sets the port back to a dedicated layer 2 access switch port. take a look at the show VLAN output. Nexus 7K config if SHVLAN 1 default active ETH 3/20 ETH3/21 ETH3/22 ETH3/23 ETH3/24 ETH3/25 ETH3/26 ETH3/27 ETH3/28 2 sales active ETH3/28 3 marketing active ETH3/28 ETH4/29 4 accounting active ETH4/28. As I mentioned, the trunk links show up in the show VLAN output, and we see that port E3/4/28 is now listed under each VLAN, but to me this output can get kind of annoying if you have a lot of trunk links. As far as I'm concerned, this is what the show interface trunk command is for, defining the allowed VLANs on a trunk. Because trunk ports send and receive information from all VLANs by default, if a frame is untagged, it'll be sent to the management VLAN. This applies to the extended range VLANs too, but we can remove VLANs from the allowed list to prevent traffic from certain VLANs from traveling to a trunk link. I'm going to do that now using the switch port trunk allowed VLAN command. Nexus 7K config if switch port trunk allowed set allowed VLAN characteristics when interface is in trunking mode. Native set trunking native characteristics when interface is in trunking mode. Nexus 7K config if switch port trunk allowed VLAN 1 3967 4048 4093 VLAN IDs of the allowed VLANs when this port in trunking mode. Add all VLANs to the current list. All VLANs except the following no VLANs. Remove VLANs from the current list. Nexus 7K config if switch port trunk allowed VLAN remove 3. Nexus 7K config if show INT trunk port native status port VLAN channel ETH3/28 1 trunking port VLANs allowed on trunk ETH3/28 1 2 4 3967 4048 4093. VLAN 3 is no longer allowed across E3/4/28 trunk line, but that's not all that can be done using this command. With this we can do the following: add and remove individual VLANs to the link, allow all VLANs across the trunk link the default, or allow none at all, allow all VLANs excluding the ones you choose by hand. Most of the time people use this command to remove individual VLANs from links. Next I'm going to show you how to configure a native VLAN for a trunk before we get into routing between VLANs. Changing or modifying the trunk native VLAN. As I said, you might not want to change the trunk port native VLAN from VLAN 1, but you can, and some people can do it for secure reasons. To change the native VLAN, use the following command: Nexus 7K config if switch port trunk native VLAN *1 3967 4048 4093 VLAN ID of the native VLAN when this port is in trunking mode. Nexus 7K config if switch port trunk native VLAN 600. You can see that I've changed my native VLAN on my trunk link to 600. I can verify this action Using the show running config command, we can see the configuration under the trunk link. Exclamation mark interface Ethernet 3/28 switch port mode trunk switch port trunk native VLAN 600 switch port trunk allowed VLAN 1 2 4 3967 4048 4093. In addition to the show run command, the show interface switch port command is an exam objective and displays the trunking native mode VLAN for port Ethernet 3/28. Here's an example. Nexus 7K SHINT E3/28 switch port name Ethernet 3/28 switch port enabled switch port monitor not enabled operational mode trunk access mode VLAN 1 default trunking native mode VLAN 600 VLAN not created trunking VLANs enabled 1 2 4 3967 4048 4093 administrative private VLAN primary host association none administrative private VLAN secondary host association none administrative private VLAN primary group mapping none administrative private VLAN secondary mapping none administrative private VLAN trunking native VLAN none administrative private VLAN trunk encapsulation .1q administrative private VLAN trunk normal VLANs none administrative private VLAN trunk private VLANs none operational private VLAN none. The show interface switch port command reveals the native VLAN for that interface, as does the show interface trunk command. Make sure you remember both commands and don't forget that all switches on a given trunk must use the same native VLAN or you won't be able to send management traffic down that link. So I'm going to leave it here today for this video. If you like listening, please consider like, sharing and subscribing. Thank you.